1949. As an infant nation state emerges from the trauma of its birth and begins to address the issues of cohesion, identity, and culture, a 27-year-old artist exhibits her work in Karachi. To understand the significance of this event and the departure that it boldly proclaims, we need to take a quick look at the leading Pakistani artists of the time who are defining what painting is and perhaps should be. Let's just, okay. Haji Sharif is painstakingly executing the delicacy of the Mughal miniature. Ustad Allah Bakhsh is painting the Punjab and its mythologies in a style that gently echoes the work of Raja Ravi Verma. Anna Molka Ahmed, landscape and portraiture painter, her landscapes and her portraits are layered and strong and reference late 19th century European painting. In East Pakistan, as it was then, Zainul Abidin delivers both the stark realities of an oppressive society and the romance of the countryside. Interestingly, the same approach to art in another medium will give Satyajit Ray the Golden Palm, the Golden Award at Cannes in about 5 years. Then there is the master himself. Abdurrahman Chughtai has liberated the miniature from the album, given its scale, and created a deeply engaging world of line and color. The influence of Shanti Niketan and the Bengal school still lurks on the periphery in the work of artists like Ferdi Rahmi. Then this happens. Zubaida Agha has disrupted art in Pakistan through a bold, in-your-face intervention. A young woman artist, at a time when the premier art school in the country is close to women, has brought modernism to Pakistan. Wow. Okay. Good evening. Welcome to this session on the art of Zubaida Agha. On behalf of LLF, I would like to welcome all of you. We are very fortunate to have Salima Hashmi with us this evening. Salima is known to all of us as an artist, an art historian, an art critic, a university professor, and a human rights activist. The last thing she needs is an introduction. Salima, thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Let me begin by asking you a straightforward question. What is the significance of Zubaida Agha's 1949 exhibition in the history of Pakistani art? And where does Zubaida Agha's work stand in relation to what has happened before and what comes after?
Well, I think, you showed the rest of the context with these images that you just shown us. And of course, Zubaida stands totally apart from it. But perhaps one needs to sort of backtrack a bit and look at how she got there. Because, 1946, All India Art Exhibition, in which Zubaida paid 4 annas for her entry. Professional artists paid 1 rupee. Charles Fabry, the critic, and of course, the director, curator of the Lahore Museum, comments on her work and says the most remarkable exhibits are 4 oil paintings by Zubaida Agha, 3 abstracts, more definitely surrealistic. The wind, he talks about the painting, he says, is brilliant and profound. And I recommend those who are not accustomed to non-representational art to have a long look at this interesting rhythm. So 49 didn't come out of nowhere. Zubaida, who moved from her family's farm in Sahiwal, which was at that time called Montgomery, and she talks about the idyllic childhood that she had with horses and plants and animals, and came to Connect College to study. Might have been a bit fish out of water because she talked about having dreams and then wanting to paint dreams. She also studied the piano. So by the time she graduated, she already had an idea that painting her dreams was something that she could carry on with. And she studied with B.C. Sanyal. But as she very candidly told me, I didn't care much for his work. Obviously, because of course he was in the academic or also the partly the Bengal tradition. But something else happened. There was this interesting prisoner of war, an Italian count, who was in Harsbanspura in a camp for prisoners of war. And somehow he was, prevailed upon to teach her to paint because he was an artist. And so he used to cycle from Harbanspura to Mayo Gardens, where she was, and teach her. And apparently, he was a tremendously exacting teacher. He was very much in the mode of André Lot and Picasso, and therefore not what she was doing with B.C. Sanyal at all. And as she herself said that, he insisted on her doing at least 8 to 10 drawings a day. And alongside this, she was studying Greek philosophy, as she said, and mythology. And, I suppose she was still dabbling in the piano. So this is a person who was being trained by an Italian count who was very much a modernist and was very exacting. So presumably, there was a lot going on before the 49 exhibition. And no surprise then, the image that you showed, it was pretty revolutionary, but Charles Fabry had already talked about it. And for this exhibition, S.N. Gupta wrote in 49 that Zubaida Agha is the only abstractionist painter in Pakistan. And the alphabet of her painting is largely unknown here. And the first response to Miss Agha's painting in one's mind is a wonder. What are those shapes? Never seen before, yet strangely familiar. I've asked the artist many a time. And when I asked for an explanation, pointed to one, and this is what she answered with a quiet finality. And she told me, this is ideal life. And the way she said it, it told me there was nothing more to add. And really, when I think back to S.N. Gumpa's description of her, it's pretty much the way she continued for a great deal of her professional life.
Mm-hmm.
The insistence that the viewer work hard.
Okay. And they had to, I guess, because one of the things I noticed reading about the reviews that came out, or reading the reviews that came out rather, at the time of the 49 exhibition, is that the art critic fraternity was just divided, split. They either hated it or they said, well, it's good, but we really have to think about all this stuff. This we have not seen. So I think the disruption is definitely there. There is no doubt about it.
But don't forget, I mean, her brother, in fact, her whole family was highly educated and they were not strangers to the art world. He was an art critic and wrote. He was a civil servant, of course. So, I mean, I think that there was enough confidence around her and in her for her to be able to take on the critics.
Yes, of course. And I mean, it appears to me that from the few interviews that are available and, archived, etc., that she stood her ground very strongly. And, as you said, with a quiet smile said, well, this is what I do. Right? And fine. Yeah, fine. So the exhibition happens. She drops this bomb, which we have discussed, stuns her audience, leaves Pakistan a year or so later for St. Martin's in London, and quickly moves to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Now it is post-war Europe. The art market is picking up. Cubism, Fauvism, Surrealism have been accepted for some time. Mondrian and Kandinsky have only been dead a few years. The avant-garde in Paris is in full swing. Soulages, Dubuffet, Polyakov are all active.
Mhm.
It is a vibrant environment brimming with creativity and experimentation. Can you tell us a little bit about the main influences that Zubaida Agha absorbs in London and Paris, and how are they reflected in their work, in her work?
Well, the first question, of course, I asked myself,
Yes.
I didn't quite ask her, though I was trying to read because this was an extended interviews that I had with her way back in the 90s. How come she transferred so fast from St. Martin's to École des Beaux-Arts? Was it the stuffy St. Martin's? I mean, even the Slade was much more vibrant. Um, I mean, she told me that she took 800 drawings with her to London. So I can, and knowing the British art school the way that I do and did, I can imagine they must have been pretty confounded to have this, girl coming from across the world with these 800 drawings under her arm, and none of them really conforming to what they would have expected, because after all, this was still shades of the Raj in the British Art School. I know that when I faced it in 1962, when I went as a student, even then there was certain things were expected of you. You had to in some way reflect where you came from. And of course, Zubaida was having none of that. My guess is that she must have found it very stuffy. And therefore, as she said, after a few months, just a few months, she transferred to the École des Beaux-Arts. And as you've said, that was a very different place and a very different time. Post-war, so many emigres were coming into Paris from, Hungary, from Romania, from Germany, even from Switzerland. And and there it was a real melting pot. I mean, even, and of course the Americans. I mean, so many Americans. Um, I remember reading somewhere that Ellsworth Kelly had talked about, what a profound impact just looking at windows made to him, rather than anything in the Museum of Modern Art. And you had, people like Hans Hartung coming from Germany. You had Vasarely, who came from Hungary. You mentioned the Buffet, Giacometti. I mean, Baltos, who's Polish, Hervé, Hungarian. I mean, so many of them. And then there was a sort of the counterpoint, which was the Steel movement, which was far more, I would say, going back to basics of design. So it was a melting pot, and I think that the École des Beaux-Arts, even much later, had a kind of openness because they had the system was totally different to what was in St. Martin's. And you had, the artist in the studio, the master, and the students flowed through it. And much more teaching went on outside the teaching studio than actually within the studio. So she was free to experiment. She was free to absorb, and I think it must have suited her far more, owing to her background with the Italian count. I sometimes used to wonder, as she was telling me about her lessons with him, whether she had a crush on him or not. But that's just my curiosity.
That's all
But
right.
yeah, but certainly all that she learned from him, and must have had been far more in tune with what she found in Paris, and therefore reaffirmed her vision,
Mhm.
which my instinct tells me was challenged in London.
Mhm.
Um, so therefore, all of these things that she experienced in Paris, what she saw, what she talked about, uh, you found shades of it far later in some of the conversations in which she felt, really held her own. So therefore, no surprise then that when she was able to have a solo exhibition in London, she was also able to have a solo exhibition in Paris before she returned to Pakistan. And you had that an artist who had a thorough grounding
Mhm.
in all of these movements that you've talked about, but was also able to hold her own and to really sharpen her own vision
Mhm.
before she returned.
Because, I
Um,
see some of her work. I haven't got the picture up here. There is a painting of hers which is done in somewhere in the 60s, which is called Karachi, the City at Night, or something like that. And
yes,
the
yes,
echoes of Mondrian are significant over there. In
yes.
the picture that I showed, you see echoes of Max Ernst and the Surrealists over there
Hmm.
as well.
Hmm.
So there is a lot of absorption that's going on, which is a wonderful thing. But what I find quite interesting is that in the early 50s, it was not very common for a young woman from an upper middle class family in Pakistan to be packed off to art school on a scholarship. So,
Well,
so marked.
actually, it was not all that. We know several others who went around
Okay.
that time.
Yeah, yeah.
There was Jamila Zafar who went to the Slade. There was Asma, I'm forgetting her second name. She went off to the Slade also. You had Abasi Abidi who went to
Yeah.
the Central School. So they seem to have been women, especially. I mean, of course, you had people like Khalid Iqbal who went, and then you had a whole bunch of people who
Yeah,
went,
again.
like Ali Imam and so on and so forth. But these were young women who had scholarships, who went to the best schools, and Zubaida was one of them. So she was not unique in that, but she was
Okay.
unique in her pathway, in her
Okay.
trajectory, which was quite different to these others who did very academic work,
Mhm.
um, and really were very, very in tune with Sir William Goldstream and in the Slade and so on and so forth. I mean, they felt at ease over there, and obviously Zubaida was not at ease.
Because I think, I read somewhere that one of the reasons why she moves to Paris
Mhm.
is because the tutors at Saint Martin's, as it was called then,
Mhm.
uh, liked her work a lot, but they said, this is not Indian, this is not subcontinental,
Precisely, precisely.
which was a bit of a dodgy thing to say, right? Art is art, whether it's from any part
No,
of the
no, no,
world.
no, no, absolutely not. It's what every young artist who moves from, you know, another culture, which is supposed to be carrying the burden of thousands of years of history, moves to the West. This is the first thing that's expected of them, is to somehow spew everything that they are supposed to have absorbed from their own culture and their own history. Um, and that's about, labels of identity, which are convenient for those who are uncomfortable with their idea of modernism in places other than the West.
Yeah, and here is this woman who says, "This is what I want to do." You say she takes 800 drawings,
Yes.
and does it really matter whether it's X or Y or Z? This is
Mhm.
me. Okay, that's great. Now let's turn to something that I think is quite important. I don't know whether you agree with me on this or not. Is that while she is away, I know you'll agree with the first part, Pakistan begins to change as the experiment with representative government begins to show signs of stress. In 1951, an attempted coup against the government fails, and those involved, including Faiz Ahmed Faiz, are imprisoned. A few months later, the students of Dhaka University protest against the national language of Pakistan. Zubaida Agha returns home in 1952, just as these things have happened. She has a few exhibitions, but leads a relatively non public life. In 1958, Pakistan sees its first military takeover, and dissent is forcefully suppressed. Progressive Papers Limited is nationalized. Faiz Saab is in exile. Hassan Nasir will die under interrogation at the Lahore fort a year or so later. However, the military government does commit serious resources to projecting a modernizing image. The promotion and sponsorship of art appears to be a part of this official strategy. In 1961, Zubaida Agha takes over as the director of the officially supported Gallery of Contemporary Art in Rawalpindi. Interestingly, interesting how the military government not only leaves art alone, but actually promotes it. I hear that Ayub Khan also gave uh, either Haji Sharif or Ustad Allah Baksh a medal for pride of performance and all that sort of stuff. And there is exhibitions at the gallery are opened by ministers. Even the field marshal himself addresses a function there. What is the role played by this state-supported institutional initiative, which Zubaida Agha leads over the next 10 or 15 years? Sorry for being long-winded, but I think the
No,
context.
I think you're making a very important point, because you see, straight after Ayub Khan took over, the first knee-jerk thing which military dictators
Salima, I think you're off. I can't hear you.
the
Yeah,
possible
fine.
dissenting voices into jail, and Faiz is one of them, and they go off into jail for 4, 5, 6 months, some for longer, and some like Hassan Nasir never come back. I think, but the thing is, Faiz is not in exile yet. When
Okay,
he
fine.
comes out, Progressive Papers is gone. It's been taken over by the army. So what does he do? Well, he takes over the Lahore Arts Council as a secretary, and it's not a straightforward government body, but it exists on a government grant.
Yeah, that's
So, and he's given free rein. And actually, you know, while he was there in the Arts Council, he heard about Nasir in the Lahore fort. He was given the news, and therefore, then, that's how the questions came up, what happened to him. But certainly, as you pointed out, there was government sponsored patronage for the arts. The Writers Guild was set up so that you had compliant writers, being part of a government sponsored setup. And yes, Rawalpindi Art Galleries, the Contemporary Art Gallery, it was in her house, but yes, she got support. Zubaida got support from the government, but this was the first military dictatorship. It had a very strong nexus with the bureaucracy. And Pakistani bureaucracy had many intellectuals, and
yes.
many of them were people like Altaf Gohar, or Agha Hamid for that matter. They were part of the setup, part of the administration. And yes, they ensured that the dictatorship had a cultured face, if you like. We had not entered the Ziaul Haq period as yet. And
Yes.
therefore, there was a lot of patronage, but then it fitted in with where we found ourselves globally, which was strongly in the American camp.
Mhm.
And therefore, if you look at how the United States Information Services worked in places like Pakistan, the exhibitions they brought out were all of abstract painters. Recent studies over the last 5, 10 years have found that the CIA was very strongly involved in supporting,
Mhm.
the New York School of Abstract Expressionists, because it demonstrated the free society, the free world, as opposed to the Soviet bloc, who were all diligently painting social realist paintings.
Mhm.
And therefore, of course, Zubaida's oeuvre was very much, in sympathy. I'm not suggesting that, she was part of the setup, but in the sense that she would have support. Um, and so did a whole lot of other people. There was music was supported. People were given, as you've mentioned, medals for pride of performance. And there was a lot of stress on, for example, the All Pakistan National Exhibition, The first ones were held, 60, 61, 62, in which Novera Ahmed, for example, won the first prize for sculpture. So it was a time in which there was quite a determined effort to ensure that there was enough patronage for every kind of an art form. And it was also the time when amateur theatre, flourished in Karachi, in Rawalpindi, and in Lahore. Um, the Arts Council was going in Karachi, the Arts Council was certainly going in Lahore, and it was going in Rawalpindi.
The Arts Council in Karachi was the result of an initiative by J. Rahim and his wife.
That's right. Earlier, and his wife,
Yeah.
Esther, was one of the, the founding members of the Karachi Arts Council. So the bureaucrats were very involved in the promotion of art and of literature. A lot of it backfired, of course, and by 1962, Fairs had decided he'd had enough and left and went into exile. So I think that these things are very interestingly, they're parallels that are going on. And then, of course, a few years later, with the decade of progress, decade of development being celebrated, it all blew up. But it's very worthwhile to look at the repertoire of exhibitions that Zubaida Agha actually, organized in her gallery. There was a great stress on younger artists. She, in fact, Zahur al-Akhlaq once told me that was the first gallery group show that he participated in after he graduated, was in the Contemporary Art Galleries in Rawalpindi. She brought artists from what was then East Pakistan. And so they were seen for the first time in places like Rawalpindi. They remember her artists, many, many years later, post 71. They remembered her with great fondness. She was not a talkative person at all, but there was this kind of private, very quiet presence, and she would nudge unconventional work into the space that she thought that it was deserved. So she did a great deal actually in those years in which she was running the gallery, and until, as she said, she got tired and she decided to pack it all in and move to Islamabad.
Because you see, interestingly, in East Pakistan, as it was called then, there was a considerable amount happening on the abstract art front. Then and a little bit later, then first you had, of course, Zainul Abidin, then who was different, but then you had Kibriya, and you had Devdas Chakraborty, Aminul Islam, Murtaza Bashir. And actually, Murtaza Bashir came and spent a lot of time in Lahore.
Yes, very much so. And that's how I bought my first painting, from the proceeds of a play that I acted in from his first exhibition.
It's interesting that the government actually, in terms of, as you say, putting on a face to whatever it wants to cover, promotes art, music, and I think in her own way, Zubaida Agha, as you say, does have a very important role to play in this, because she brings artists, encourages them. She even holds art exhibitions for children's work. Right?
Yes,
she's
absolutely.
She's doing a lot for this effort, and I guess she's interested in art only, and whether it's one government or another, provided it supports her, it's fine, and that's perfectly all right. Now, let me come to something which has intrigued me a bit. The Lahore Art Circle, which you have written about, has been established by Shakir Ali with Anwar Jalal Shemza, Ahmed Parvez, Moin Najmi, just before Zubaida Agha returns to Pakistan. Looking at the documentation that is available, her relationship with the Lahore Art Circle is difficult to establish. She appears a little aloof. I don't know whether she is or she isn't. And it would be interesting for us to for you to share some of your thoughts on this, because one would have expected greater signs of collaboration, as the artists of the Lahore Art Circle are also working in a modernist style.
Mhm. Well, I think this is an important question, and we don't really have much to go on except things that are anecdotal. And,
Mhm.
you know, in my interviews with her, for example, and what I observed, she was friends with Shakir Ali. Out of this whole bunch, she was friends with him.
Who
And
was
I
another
can
very
well,
quiet person. Who was another very quiet person. So I wonder how this.
precisely, he was quiet, and also he was what I think she would consider civilized.
Yes, of course.
Because I think she was one of the people who would sort of retreat into her shell in the face of boorish behavior, and there was plenty
Okay.
of that in the Lahore Art Circle.
I am sure
Even
there was.
so, I mean, even as a young schoolgirl, as I was then, I saw the kind of vitriolic arguments that used to happen, and there was a lot of infighting. Um, you know, especially as the evening wore on.
Mhm.
But I think that Shakir was always restrained, and I think that since Zubaida was the same, they would have had that in common. I think that both of them were prone to talk in monosyllables. I think that when they made pronouncements, they would be, as mentioned earlier by S.N. Gupta, they would be kind of final, because
Mhm.
there would be an assessment of a thought process.
Mhm.
And so that was Shakir's personality, and it was very much Zubaida's personality also. And though that assessment didn't come out of nowhere.
Mhm.
I remember that I asked her, becoming a little bit cheeky and personal, that why she didn't get married. What I didn't dare imply that she didn't have relationships, but I wanted to know why. The the idea of marriage either eluded her, and she said that she found people were cruel,
Okay.
which to me was, yeah, which was it was a moment of insight when she said that. And so she said, so I didn't want to enter into that kind of a situation.
Mhm.
I think she was tremendously refined in her temperament, and therefore I can understand that she would not have allowed, you know well, behavior that she did not consider proper, but not in the narrow sense. So I think that the Lahore Art Circle, while she must have approved of some of their ways and some of ways of seeing and ways of looking at new directions in art making, she would have really shrank back from some of the ways in which they were discussing it, and simply the sort of clash of personalities that was within the Lahore Art Circle. I
Mhm.
myself witnessed, the fact they would make sort of mini groups within a very small group, and one group will be warring with the other group. And I should think that she would have considered that a waste of time, knowing
And I
her.
also don't see her sitting in the Park Tea House in Lahore with all these people
No, she
discussing.
would have. Yeah, she would have preferred to have been in Shakir's studio, which
Yes.
at that time, of course, it was. I mean, this was before Shakir became the principal, so therefore it would be in his rather modest apartment, not very far from the Lahore Arts Council, which was in what was the hotel, which was Nido's, which was nearby, and then later in Samnabad. So therefore, you're right that I think that the environs would have been of some some consequence in getting her to a place and getting her into a conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, I can see that she agreed with the output, but not the source. It's
Yes,
fine.
yeah,
It works sometimes. Now, people are ask all the time, and I think it's a bit of a forced thing, but let me put it like this. One issue that lingers is the elephant in the room is Amrita Shergill. Right? I mean,
Mhm,
the influence is not obvious to me, and I'm sure I'm missing something here. And if I am, please tell me. Shergill painted
mhm,
people, Zubaida Agha did not, or not a
mhm,
lot.
mhm,
One can force a connection between things like her cotton pickers and Shergill's village scenes, but at
mhm,
least in my mind, the connection is tenuous.
mhm.
Admittedly, Agha Saab, her brother, had written a book about a monograph or a set of articles about Amrita Shergill. She was known to the family.
Yes, yes.
Zubaida Agha had one or two of her paintings, which she donated to a museum. I hope that they are still there.
No, they're
Sher-
not.
okay, fine. So maybe they're in some going. Shergill was known in Lahore and died there when Zubaida Agha was in early 20s.
Mhm.
Is there any link between the two?
Well, she spoke of her, when she was talking about her time in Lahore, she said that she was a great admirer of Amrita's.
Mhm.
Um, but also said that she was not influenced by her. I mean, which was at that time she was talking about her painting. So I think that she was quite conscious of the fact that she thought differently. But there's no doubt that the reason for her admiration for Amrita was the fact that Amrita again was a person who was painting like nobody else was at that time. I
Yes.
mean, the fact that I remember B.C. Sanyal told me that Amrita made fun of his painting, and she took him off to Amritsar and showed him work which was in a private collection of miniatures, because of course all of this whole generation of artists were very much in the sort of Victorian, doing Victorian paintings, or then they were doing these sentimental um, works which were derived from the idea of the Bengal school. So, and of course, Amrita was totally dismissive of this sort of sentimentality, as she called it, of the art makers. And I think definitely Zubaida must have responded to that. As you pointed out, her brother was a very close friend of Amrita's. In fact, he had organized her exhibition, which was supposed to open and it was, the day before she passed away. He described how he went to the house, to her place, and was told by her husband, who called from upstairs and said, Amrita is gone, passed away. And he tried to push his way into the house to find out what happened, and he was denied entry. So it was, I mean, a great trauma for him, because he was a great admirer of work, and the whole exhibition had been organized by him in the YWCA hall. She was in close walking distance from her house. So I think that, yes, there was definite connection, and you're right that you don't find it reflected. But when you're talking about something like the cotton pickers, um, I mean, I think there was a lot of thinking going on about how to look at your environment, how to look at the folk tradition. How, I mean, because if you look at the work of Jamini Roy, also around at that time, very much so, there is a way of making a line. There is a way of making a palette. There is a way of describing form, which is something that is part of her, um, I would say, her sensibility. She uses it in a very different way, but there are streams there that come from things that Amrita also culled for her own work. And you mentioned the cotton pickers, and I think it's significant because Zubaida told me that Berengeri made the drawings for that painting over and over and over again for that particular work. So it went through a series of transformations before it became the cotton pickers as we see it,
Yeah, there
which
was
suggests
also one in bronze, no? There was also a bronze.
Yes, there
other
was.
than what?
Yes, and she had that in her house. Yes. So that suggests to me when she said that she went through, a series of redoing the drawing for that work, it must have started out as something more representational. I mean, that's what suggested to me. And then slowly it was altered, it was simplified more and more. Its composition must have been altered. And certainly when she says drawings, I'm presuming that they were monochromatic.
Mhm.
And then later it became what it became. So the the connection between the two of them is a connection of the milieu.
Okay.
And that to me is very, very important. Lahore was a melting pot before 1947. And you had more than one kind of influence there. Certainly, Chughtai was already there. So, the Lahore school of the 40s was very vibrant as one end of the spectrum. Amrita had totally shaken the art world and then, left it as suddenly as she arrived in it. And there were a whole lot of other people. I mean, there were the Sanyas, there were the S.N. Guptas, there were so many others working. And there were those who were working in the style of Chuktai also.
Yes, of
So,
course.
so there were so many of these people who really livened the Lahore art world. Uh, and of course, with 47, with the grand exodus, it was, you know, there's just a skeleton left. The fine arts department was set up in 1940 in the Punjab University across
By
the
Anna
road
Molka
from
Ahmed,
the
no?
Mayo School of Art. Yes, with Anna Molka and
Because the
company.
Mayo School was not taking women, right?
Yes, true. They were taking them off campus, if
Of
I may.
whatever.
Because Sanyal had his own little teaching studio,
Yeah.
which was above Regal Cinema.
Yes.
And so they used to, and that's where Zubaida used to go after she graduated. So, and in fact, he told me that he donated all of its furniture and everything to the Lahore Arts Council when he was leaving in 47. So, so there were these pockets of activity. And I think that is how you see Amrita Shergill and Zubaida Agha. You see them as people in the same place at the same time. One, a very, very mature and sure artist who was, blazing a new kind of trail, and the other was a person, young person, impressionable, just trying to find her feet.
Who blazed
And
her own trail later
yes,
on.
who is her
A
own
very
trail
different
soon after.
very, very different trail indeed. No, that's really wonderful, Salima. Anything else you would like to add that we have not covered?
I think that very often what one has missed when people talk of Zubaida's work is the fact that she was extremely, well, several things really. Number one, when she first mentioned how she first started painting, she wanted to paint her dreams,
Mhm.
and the fact that she was learning to play the piano at the same time. And there's a kind of a connection because she continued for her passion for listening to Western classical music because that's what she listened to. And until the last years, when I really had time to talk to her, she was constantly painting to music.
Yeah.
Um, so that is to me is significant. I remember even when we were sitting and chatting, there was, there'd be like Bach playing in the background. Or she'd suddenly say, "Oh, I love Beethoven's, ninth or something," and she'd go
And
off
she's
and put
also
it
got a
on.
painting called Beethoven's Seventh or Beethoven's
Yeah,
Sixth or
yes, she has. She's done that also, and so there was this connection between, the other kind of abstraction, and that is of music. So, the two of them going in tandem. The other thing that she was very keen to make sure was her process of actually painting. I mean, it was meticulous. She stretched her own canvases almost till the end of her life. I mean, she certainly supervised the stretching of the canvas. She was absolutely meticulous about preparing the ground. It was always oil ground for oil painting. And she was extremely proud of the fact that her colors did not change over time. And she said, it's because I have the proper oil ground on my canvas. The other thing was she always used artist's colors. And, once she described it somewhat, I'm just trying to remember, she said, you start with an idea, you start with a concept, and, um, and it comes freely. Other times you go on, and it takes a long time, and the oil takes a certain time to dry. Um, and if you want to give it a special layer or something, you have to wait. For example, I do use a deeper color to give a certain light inside it. And then I wait until it's completely dry and then add a layer. My work looks very simple, you said, but it's not simple because it takes a lot out of me. It is so difficult to express yourself in simple lines. There's a lot of physical and mental work involved. There's a process of change all the time. Sometimes you don't get the effect that you want with only a few coats of paint. So you go deeper and deeper. And then she said a nice thing, which I absolutely agree with. Some paintings hide a lot. And
That's
it
correct.
reminds me, so it reminded me of my teacher, who was Howard Hodgkin. And, he said to me, sometimes a painting's past is far more interesting than its present.
Absolutely.
So, I could well understand when she said that. And she was saying that she was very proud of the fact she never used varnish
Mhm.
on her work, because she said, and she understood that it changes the intensity of the pigment over a period of time. So and she was very proud that, I sometimes go back and look at a work that I did several decades ago, and the
Mhm.
work and the color has not changed. So I think that people who really are unaware of the process of oil painting would sometimes take for granted some of her finished products, and therefore listening to her actually describing the process was a revelation. Also, the fact that she said sometimes when a work didn't come together, she would leave it for several months and then come back to it and suddenly see the solutions would present themselves, and she'd go back to it and work. I think that, the if I were to be asked that, okay, so what um, her relationship with her work was so intense, and it consumed her, from the time that she became a painter to the point where actually she annoyed a lot of people. And
That only means you're doing your job well.
yes, so I'm not surprised that they would be a bit annoyed with her. Somebody said, for example, that, oh, you can't get anything out of her, and she brushes you off. I noticed that she didn't take the fools gladly. She just didn't suffer them. Uh, and therefore, of course, she was much of a recluse because the world is full of fools.
Yes.
So
No,
I think we have a
that's
question. I think we have a
uh,
question.
do we have a question?
Oh,
No,
I
we
don't
don't.
think. Okay, we don't, because I thought that
Well, I mean,
but I
this
was
is,
wanting to say one more thing about her,
please.
and that's something that because the reason I had all these interviews with her, of course, was because I was doing this book on women artists. And so I told her that, I'm I'm doing this book and I want doing this study and so on. So she was a bit like, that she didn't consider herself a woman artist. She felt there was, that was a kind of label that she had probably struggled against for a lot of her life. And so I sort of pressed her and I said, no. So I was lucky enough, and she did these interviews. But then I said to her that, but does gender actually come into the work? And she relented a little.
Mhm.
And she said, yes, maybe. She said, since you've been coming and talking to me, um, I've been thinking about it. And I think, yes, maybe there is something. And that something has to do with color.
Oh,
Uh, so that, to me, it kind of opened a door. And also in a discussion with Zuhur al-Akhlaq on this matter, he said to me, absolutely matter of factly, well, Zubaida is a colorist. And suddenly, many things fell into place
that's wonderful.
vis-a-vis uh, getting what they would say, getting a handle onto her work. Um, Certainly, the way she described the process helped, and the fact that she did agree that it was something to do with color, which was connected to her being a woman. Uh, that that impressed me. Number one, that she should relent enough to, to my persistence and come up with this, um, and also that she should herself um, reflect on a suggestion that a much younger person had made, and would be willing to take it seriously. I mean, this to me
Mhm.
was again was something important.
So, yeah, I mean, that's wonderful. And it's been great talking to you about one of our very important artists. Let me close by quoting someone. Dr. Musarat Hassan, in her book on Zubaida Agha, writes that she was the first painter in Pakistan who presented the conceptual aspects of modernism, unquote. I think one will not be remiss in saying that it was a job very well done. And for helping us to see that, Salima, a big thank you.
Thank you. And I hope Zubaida somewhere is smiling and having a little giggle to herself.
I hope so
Um,
too. Take care and stay safe. And inshallah, once the travel situation gets sorted out, we shall meet in Lahore. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.